I'll have to do so. Goes green.
Good morning. How's everyone this morning? Good? Excellent. Another banner day in Grey and Bruce. So we're so delighted you're here or at home. Just a shout out to everyone in this room this morning. October the 1st is National Seniors Day. So I think we should acknowledge all of the work that all of you have done on behalf of our community and our province and our country in all of your lives. You have infinite wisdom, and you should be proud to be a wise senior. So happy National Seniors Day. A couple of announcements. If you could please remember to bring your mug for your coffee. We're finding that that's kind of gone by the wayside, but it's very helpful to Reach and our social committee if you bring your own mug and take them home. And if you happen to forget it, there's the ever-present lost and found. We will guard it for you till the next week. So we'd be grateful if you could do that. When I was in Zares last Thursday, after the lecture, I ran into a B.A.L.L member who informed me that she just so much loves B.A.L.L. And she used to come in person, but because of her personal circumstances, she and her husband are now watching from home, and she still loves B.A.L.L. And I know that there are people there because of distance, because of health, because of mobility, because they like to stay in their pajamas on a Thursday morning, whatever it might be. But I'd like to give a shout out to all of those people, because we learned during COVID that we can be successful and sustainable by embracing change and running a hybrid model. So to those at home, thank you for teaching us that. And I'd like to thank Leslie Garnett this morning because Brian Caruana was not able to join us today, and Leslie learned the COVID pivot well, and she was able to get John for us this morning, whom she will introduce, but I'd like to thank Leslie for doing that. So thanks, Leslie, and if you could come introduce John.
Good morning. I'd like to introduce John Fearnall. John grew up in Owen Sound and was a teacher at the OSCVI, where he attended school. I thought it was important to have a teacher's perspective on our topic, education in a rapidly changing world, and I knew John would give us a unique point of view. John always knew that he wanted to teach because of the many influential teachers he had. He became a media literacy teacher. And John, I hope you're going to explain a bit about what media literacy is, because most of us didn't take it and don't know what it is. As well as being a teacher, John is an accomplished photographer. He describes himself as being a writer, a hiker, a bocce player, a music lover, a podcaster, a husband, and a father. John's mother told me that he has always loved school, and he was a valedictorian for his graduating class. A fellow teacher of John's told me that John is the epitome of B.A.L.L. That really grabbed me, and I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, he is always questioning, curious, and searching for more truth. I would describe him as a thinker. And now I will let John tell you about his thoughts and ideas.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm good. You can hear me? Excellent. Thanks so much for having me here today. Yes, I'm really happy to be talking to a group of lifelong learners, because I do consider myself a lifelong learner. When I taught classes, I often told my students that there were times where I really felt like I learned a lot more than my students did, and that was true kind of throughout my career, that I just kept on learning. And I have to tell you a couple things, though, before I begin. The first one is that I have been retired for 2 years now. I did retire a little bit early. And 2 nights ago, I had my first teaching nightmare I've had in forever. And it was horrible. And it's all because my mind has been so into this. The other thing I have to tell you is that I've never actually spoken to a voluntary audience like this about media literacy. So I did a dry, I have a couple friends, one who was mentioned in Leslie's introduction, they were kind enough to let me do a dry run with them. And I got to about 2 hours, and I stopped before I was done, and they basically said, okay, cut everything in half. And as you'll see on my first slide, and I'm not sure if that's coming up, perfect, I've actually cut the title in half as well. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to focus on everything I wanted to get through, but I think that's also very telling about media literacy, because there's so much that you can talk about when it comes to media literacy. And I'm going to do my best to get through as much of this as I can today. And I'm also happy to hear what Leslie said about perhaps you're not familiar with media literacy, because that's really going to be the focus, at least of the first 2/3 of this presentation. So, just to tie it into our theme, education in our rapidly changing world, when I taught the course, this was really my focus. In tomorrow's world, media and the issues associated with it will not decline in importance. In fact, as we are witnessing, our world will be increasingly dominated by mass media and communication technologies. Generations of the future will need to think critically in order to understand how the media influence society. And that's really going to be my focus today. And to be quite honest with you, I was never taught a lot of this stuff because, like you, media literacy didn't exist when I was in school. And so I'm just going to put this idea up here because I think it's a really important one. And this is how I kind of see myself and how I got to being right here, which is that self-education is, I firmly believe, the only kind of education there is. The only function of a school is to make self-education easier. Failing that, it does nothing. And that's my belief, right, is that we can only teach ourselves in many ways. And being a good teacher is more like being a coach, right, someone who can help you along the way. And I think my path is actually very much like this. So very quickly, let's just tell you a little bit about myself. That is me. Notice my very nice, I don't know what you call that, pantsuit with the stripes on at the bottom. That's the first photo I have that I know of that I connected to the media, right? I have my camera. I have no idea if I took any photos or not that day. But I've always been interested in the media, even though I didn't know what that word meant at the time. From an early age, I can remember, I think I was in Fred Steineker's grade 8 class at Strathcona, and I was the guy who was feeding the film strip into the projector, right? I found that quite fascinating. My dad was kind of an early adopter when it came to technology, so we had the old VHS machines, and we had 2 of them, and I would patch them together, and I would make videos really without knowing what I was doing, just kind of experimenting. And I still have some of those videos. I'm not sure if the tapes are still any good or not, but so I was always interested in it. I graduated OS in 1988. Media studies did not exist. The course did not exist at all, right? I went to UWO, and again, it really wasn't a thing that we talked about much. I have to tell you, even though Leslie was very kind in saying that, about me being the perfect student or whatever it was, I certainly don't see myself that way. I was a good learner, right? I loved learning and talking about ideas. I don't think I was a great student, and I didn't have great marks, and that's because I chose what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do, and that sometimes hurt me. I was very lucky in some ways. My mom says I was blessed. If you don't know my parents, they were ministers, so they like to use different terminology than I do, but they say I was blessed to get where I did. I kind of consider it a little bit of luck, but at UWO, I actually took a film studies class in my 4th year, and again, it was kind of one of these moments where I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I had never thought about film in this way. So it kind of piqued my interest a little bit. Because I wasn't a great student, I had trouble getting into teachers' college. At the time in the 80s, I think you needed about a 97% average to get into teachers' college. Boy, I did not have that. So I ended up going to Scotland to do my teacher training. And again, at the time, Scotland was kind of on the cutting edge of media literacy. And so I had an option to take an elective, and I signed up for it without, again, really knowing what it was. But it got me thinking about the importance of media literacy. And I remember even going into schools and realizing that for kids, it was almost like I was talking their language, right? Because they were much more familiar with the new technology. And so when we would actually teach it, they kind of, they paid more attention than, doing our book work and whatever else. Not that that's not worthwhile. When I came back, I taught my first English media course in 1996. And I taught my last in 2022. I don't think there was a year that I didn't teach the course. There might have been one, okay? And again, later on, I'll explain kind of what's happened to the courses in school. And in about the last decade of my teaching, I worked media literacy into everything that I taught because I really felt as I taught it, it made me realize how important it was and how lacking we were as well. So I taught English, all levels of English. I ended up teaching photography. Again, I probably wouldn't be a photographer if it wasn't teaching media literacy. I taught some leadership classes, and in all of those, I made sure that I somehow incorporated some media literacy. Okay? And I really believe that it can be incorporated into every class that we teach. Since my retirement, I continue to think and write about the media, which I think is maybe what led to me being invited here. I do use social media quite a bit, not maybe in the traditional sense. I like to challenge people. I like to challenge their ideas. I like to discuss. I try not to argue too much, but I like to discuss ideas with people, especially when they make some absurd claims that go against what I've learned related to media literacy. So, why is media literacy important? Well, media bring the world into our homes, right? I think that's quite well known. The cumulative effect of mass media is to unconsciously shape our visions of ourselves. In many ways, the media is a mirror, right? It basically kind of holds up this mirror for us to see ourselves. And that's also part of the reason why right now we're going through this time where, for a long time, we've had groups in our society who haven't seen themselves in that mirror, right? They haven't been represented. And of course, we're seeing there's also a backlash to that as well. The dangers of not thinking about media are greatest for our young children who are among our nation's heaviest but least sophisticated viewers. And let's be honest, they're being, it's coming at them from the day they're born, right? They're being put in diapers that have Mickey Mouse on them. They have apps, right, that are now designed for babies to use. They are being brought into this world of the media at a very young age. And by failing to help them develop media literacy skills, we allow their developing visions of themselves to be controlled by people whose visions and values we may not share. And again, the concepts I'm going to talk about today will make it clear what those values are. And they may not be, certainly in my case, they're not the values that I share. So I thought probably the best way for me to do this, and this is going to be a challenge, is I'm going to take you through the 8 concepts that I taught. Okay? This really was an entire course. So I'm not giving you an entire course in 45 minutes or whatever I'm going to do, but I am going to try to give you kind of the basics of the ideas, right? So you understand them yourselves. Before I get to that, we'll just talk very quickly about the definition of media literacy. Can be kind of confusing, even that word media, right? It can be singular, it can be plural. Sometimes it talks about the organization, sometimes it's actually the product. So when we talk about media literacy, this is what the curriculum says. Now I found this in, I think, both the elementary and secondary curriculum. I should tell you that, again, this is really all that's there. This is the book that I was introduced to when I came back in 1988, right? And this is all about media literacy. So basically, the curriculum says this, and I won't read it all, but basically understanding media texts, understanding the forms, the conventions, the techniques, creating media texts, and then reflecting on those skills that you learn. Nothing wrong with any of that. That's all fine. Where I struggle is that it seems to really be a focus on creating, right? Learning to use the apps, learning to use the software, creating media. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's just that I found that what's missing is the theory. And you don't necessarily learn to understand how the media affects you simply by creating it. You can, but again, if you look at, if you know what an influencer is, I'm not sure these influencers even understand the influence they're having on themselves, how they're shaping their own worldview. So I prefer this. It's actually simpler, but it does a couple things. First of all, it puts the creating at the end, right? And when I first started teaching my course, it was actually half theory, half production. And then what happened is, of course, as budgets got cut, and as our old VHS machines broke down and we couldn't replace them, we had to figure out, okay, what do we do? And I decided, I'm just going to do all theory, right? We're just going to make this entirely a theory course. And at first I thought, nobody's going to want to do this. But it actually was a bit of a blessing in disguise, because it really helped my understanding, which of course then helped me explain these things to my students. So another thing I want to emphasize is it's not just about decoding media messages. I like how this includes the systems in which they exist, right? So yes, it's important that we understand how a TV show, a film, a photograph works, but then we also need to understand, well, how does Instagram work, right? How does Facebook work? How do our network TV networks work? All of that stuff. How are our movie studios? And then, of course, number 2, we assess the influence of those messages on thoughts, on our feelings, on our behavior, right? How do they make us or help us see who we are? So, this was always an idea that I started the course with, right? That fish did not discover water. And I think in many ways, our mediated world is the same thing. We are so surrounded by these messages that for the most part, we don't even notice them, right? So I would usually put this up and just let the kids think about it for a little bit, and somebody would finally come around and say, oh, well, are we the fish? And is the water the... And I'd be, yeah, that's really the idea. And we're not often challenged to see it either, right? And there's actually a theory that the less aware of the media we are, the more effective it is. Right? Because if we don't think the media is affecting us, we kind of put our guard down. All those filters, when somebody says something to us, we usually think, oh, why is that? What's the reason behind that? With the media, if we don't think it's affecting us, we just turn those off, and so it just kind of goes through us, and it might actually be more effective. I also have to tell you quickly, I'm a big fan of Jean Kilbourne. I don't know if you know that name or not. She used to do a series called Still Killing Us Softly, and she focused on the images of females and the effect of magazine ads. And one of my favorite things that she said was, after I give my presentation, I always have people come up to me and say, advertising has absolutely no effect on me. And they were usually young men who were wearing their Budweiser hats and their Root shirts, right? Like there's just no self-awareness there. They have no sense that this is having an impact on it when it really is shaping their lives. Another thing I discovered that really helped my understanding, and then in turn my students' understanding, was this. And I don't know if you're familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave. I'll just give you a really quick rundown of how it works. If you look at the image, you can see over on the left, there are some chained prisoners, right? So Plato says, imagine there's this cave. And in this cave, there are these chained prisoners. Their necks are chained, their arms and legs are chained, they can only look ahead. And on the wall in front of them are some shadows, right? And that's all they can see. And then behind them, behind this wall, are these men, women who are carrying these shapes. And behind them is the fire, right? So they have the shapes there, the fire, the light is going through the objects and casting the shadows on the wall. And that's all these people know, right? That's all they've seen their entire lives. So Plato says, well, imagine one day that one of these guys actually works his chains off. He manages to get loose. He turns around. Of course, first he's going to be blinded, because all of a sudden he sees the light. But if he gives himself time and he thinks about what he's seeing, he then realizes, oh, there's some people there. Oh, there's a fire there. And if he keeps working himself out of the cave, he will eventually get to reality. Now, I'm not going to pretend I understand exactly what Plato was on about. I think it has to do with forms and ideas. But I do think that this sort of, oh, sorry, I forgot an important point. So he gets out there and he decides, oh, I got to go help my friends, right? They're still stuck down in that cave. So he returns, he goes down and he says, hey, people, we can be free. We can get out of here. We don't have to look at these shadows anymore. And of course, they look at him and they say, you're crazy, right? You have no idea what you're talking about. This is all that exists. I hope I'm not going to be that person today that you're going to get angry at, right, for revealing some of these things. But that was my experience teaching this course, is that sometimes my students would get quite hostile with me, right, because I was kind of showing them, I hesitate using this word, the truth, right, or what's real. Okay, versus their mediated world. So like I said, this allegory also works very well with the media. And so I've just kind of said, in this sense, our prisoners are the general population, right? Our shadows are the TV, the movies, the newspapers, the billboards, where we get all this information. The shapes behind them are the actual media, right? The light is the power behind the media, the money, right? The people making their way out are the truth seekers. And then once they're out, they see real life. So again, often my goal in the course was at least for my students to consider this, right? Is what you're seeing real, okay? Or is there something else besides that? There's that line, we don't know what we don't know, right? And in many cases, I would say that's what the prisoners are like. They just have no understanding that there's anything outside of that. I used to have a great image that I searched for high and low and couldn't find it, where it's actually the allegory of the cave, but instead of being in a cave, they're in a movie theater, right? So the people are looking at the movies. Same idea. I also found this one. I'm going to share it. It kind of takes it to another level, and I'm not sure I can explain it all. But really, this perhaps is the modern cave. Because not only are we seeing the shadows, we're now also being encouraged to create the shadows. Right? Again, don't go too far into that one. That still confuses me. I'm going to have to spend some time with this image to try to figure it out. But again, just simply sharing that with my students, I think helped them understand it a little bit. And the allegory itself was a little confusing. So I would often then show them something like the Matrix. If you don't know the Matrix is the allegory of the cave, right? Neo gets taken out of the real world, he takes the pill, suddenly he's in reality, he has a long time where he has to kind of figure out what's going on, and then he returns to try to help others, and there's real resistance to that. So I would sometimes show them that, or I would show them the Truman Show. If you haven't seen the Truman Show, I highly recommend it. My students at first would think, I can remember, because we had to watch movies in a very unnatural way, kind of half and half. What a horrible way to watch a film, get halfway through it and then have to stop for a day. But that, that's the reality. And they would tell me after the first half, oh, this is weird and this is confusing. But by the end of it, they got it, right? They realized. Because if you don't know, the Truman Show is about a guy, Truman, who is raised from the day he's born in a soundstage. Everybody in his life are actors, right? And then one day a light falls and hits in front of him, and that starts on his path of kind of leaving that cave, right? He starts questioning and he wants to get out. And there's all little details in there about how they keep him in the cave. Things like he wants to travel, he goes to the travel agent and there's a poster on the wall, and on the poster there's a plane on fire crashing, right? Like, so who would go to a travel agent and see that? But the whole idea is the fear that is used to keep him in that cave, okay? So we would watch that, and again, at the end of the story, the whole idea is Truman going to leave or not? And as he's about to leave, he's talking to the creator of the show, and this is my favorite line from the whole film: we accept the reality of the world with which we are presented. All right? And so again, we would spend a lot of time talking about that idea. Do we actually, is this real, or is this just something that we are being presented? So once I kind of piqued their interest that way, then we'd start talking about, well, what are the shadows, right? What is the water? And often the best way of doing that was simply using numbers, all right, giving them some statistics. So I'm going to give you some of these today as well. This actually comes from this book. By the time students finish high school, they will have spent an average of 11,000 hours in school. So as soon as I told them that, they were like, that's horrible. That depressed them right away. And then I shared, in that same time, they will have watched 15,000 hours of TV, listened to 10,500 hours of pop music, watched several hundred films, and been exposed to thousands of ads. This was 1988, right? This was in 1988. So again, we know that today, this was the days of the VHS machine that we had to roll into the classrooms, right? No phones, no computers. So all of those things are now in their pockets. So imagine the amount of time that they're spending with the media compared to them. And here are some other interesting stats. The average number of screens in our homes. In 1999, it was 2.24. They're always like, how can you have 0.24 of a screen? I'm like, it's an average, right? And that was TVs. 2017, 7.3 screens. 2023, 11.1. Now think for yourself, right? Always good to do these things on our own. How many screens do you have in your home? This has to include TVs, computers, tablets, phones, right? And I'm probably missing some things. By the way, I also learned in doing some research that if you include the other connected devices, like thermostats, these speakers, it's 17. 17 connected devices on average in our home. Okay? Sorry, I screwed that up. My apologies. So, number of ads seen by the average person per day in 1970 was 500. Okay? Oh, reaction to that one. Wait till you see this one. Number of ads seen in the average person per day in 2024, 5,000. 5,000 ads, right? Now again, I can tell by your reaction, you're like, oh, that can't be true. But think about it. I'd always say to my students, take a walk. Take a walk from when we were up at OSDSS, from there to McDonald's, and count the number of messages that are in windows, right? That are on signs. It actually is quite astounding. You look at one window and you might have 20 different ads in that one window. Okay? And that was an exercise that we sometimes did. And it's very useful again because, like I'm saying, we're the fish, that's the water. We don't really think about it that much. We just accept it as being, well, this is just the way it is, right? So we have to think about it. Once we got there, we would start talking a little bit about how much time do you actually spend with the media, right? And I like to always give them little things because, remember my career basically, not only did it go along with media education, but it went along with the introduction of the phone. When I started teaching, the phone didn't exist. And then there was the flip phone, and then by the end of my career, every student had a smartphone. And so what I would share things with them, about phone addiction. And one of the things that I learned is that if you are addicted to your phone, you might experience something called phantom buzzing. And I don't know if you've experienced this or not, but you feel like your phone is buzzed, and you go and check it, and there's nothing there. And I would tell that to my students, and you could see their eyes kind of open up and go, yeah, that has happened to me quite often, right? We would talk about their relationships with their phones, and they would tell me things like, I had some students who slept with their phones under their pillows because they didn't want to miss anything, right? So if they got a message, if there was whatever, the buzzing or the sound would wake them up, right? I would often say to them, you might want to, think about that's probably a sign of addiction, right? That you're doing these things. In the course, I would have them start with doing visual autobiography for me. And all that was I wanted to know, what sort of stuff do you like? And then also in there, I would include hours, right? How many hours per day, per week do you watch movies? Do you watch TV? There were a couple interesting things that came out of that. One of the things that I noticed throughout my career was that when I first started teaching, there was always the common culture, right? We would talk about The Simpsons. Everybody knew who The Simpsons was. Towards the end of my career, I might have students on this side of the room who have a culture that is completely different than the kids on this side of the room. Those common things have kind of disappeared amongst our young people, right? Again, it's the splitting and the amount of content, of course, that's out there. When we did the time part, I would get them, if they told me, okay, I watch 7 hours a day, we would just do this little kind of silly calculation where I would tell them, okay, the average person lives this long, multiply this by the number of weeks, by the number of years. How many years are you spending with the media? And I had one, I think the highest was like 45 years. And I had to remind them that that doesn't include sleeping, right? That's 45 straight years that you are connected to the media. So again, just trying to kind of make them aware of how much time they are spending with it. Of course, if you wanted to do this, you could do it yourself maybe, because I would say to them, pull your phones out, check your screen report, right? We all have this in our phones. How many hours are you spending on your phone a day? Because we have a tendency, I think, to always underestimate, right? We say, oh yeah, it's 3 hours. And oh, no, it's actually 5.5 hours, right? Or something like that. According to TV Free America in 1999, the number of minutes per week the average child watched TV, then it was 1,680, which is about 4 hours a day. And then they gave this stat, which I always found interesting. The number of minutes per week the average child spends in meaningful conversation with their parents, 38.5, right? So again, I think I can tell by the laughter, you get a sense of who is educating our children, right? I mean, the media has a big hand in this, for sure. Today, on average, how much time do Canadians spend on the internet every day? 6 hours and 35 minutes. So again, that's average, right? And I always had to tell my students, because someone would say, well, I don't do that. Okay, well, if you only spend an hour, if you think about averages, that means that there's somebody that's spending 13 hours, right? So again, it's an average. So once I think I had them convinced, okay, maybe I need to think about this a little bit, right? I would often actually start the course by having them do some writing. Do you think the media affects your life, right? Or how does it, or something like that. And then after we did this, I would get them to rewrite it. And there usually was a shift, right? They would at least acknowledge, okay, I will admit that, yes, the media is a bigger part of my life than I thought. So then we would talk about things like this, the mental environment. And if you're not familiar with the mental environment, here's my quick definition. This is the entire landscape of ideas and images that we humans create and navigate through with our minds. And then I would challenge them to explore their mental environment. And I would say, okay, we're just going to sit quietly with a piece of paper, and you're going to write down everything that comes into your mind, right? Every idea that comes into it. Now, first of all, getting them to sit quietly for 5 minutes was a challenge, especially with phones. For some of them, it's very difficult, right? They can't not touch their phone. But they would usually do it. And then once they had that list, I would say, okay, go back through the list and note how many are there because of the media. Right? Where did it come from? Did it come from your phone? Did it come from the radio on the way to school? Did it come from a friend? And if it came from a friend, where did they get that information? And again, it was pretty obvious that the majority of the information that they're getting was coming through the media. All right? We would then I'd introduce this idea to them. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the idea of Mindshare or not, but basically it says that Mindshare is the portion of one's mind or headspace that has been garnered by a concept. Okay? And we talk about, well, who wants Mindshare? Well, clearly parents want some Mindshare, school wants some Mindshare, maybe religion wants some Mindshare, government wants some Mindshare. And then I'd say to them, okay, but who was probably doing the best job of it? And we talk about this, because Mindshare is also a marketing term that describes the amount of consumer awareness or popularity surrounding a particular product, idea, or company, right? So companies are after Mindshare. That's why we see these things over and over and over again. And I would say to them, in my mind, some of them have almost done too good of a job. For example, Kleenex. right? We all use, if you're like me, I always, can I have a Kleenex? And I'd have to say to them, well, you understand that that's a brand name, right? And they say, what? And I say, well, it's really a tissue. Can I have a tissue? And they'd all laugh, haha, what's a tissue? Like, and because they just didn't understand it. And I would say, well, that's, again, I think it's because Kleenex is, I'm not sure it helps them sell more Kleenex, to be honest with you. Maybe they've done too good of a job. But it is it's evidence of Mindshare, right? That they've managed to convince us that that's the term we use. And even if they didn't understand, they say, well, I spent a year in the UK, and in the UK they do their hoovering. And they'd look at me like, what? I'd say, well, Hoover's a brand name. But again, in the UK, apparently Hoover has done such a good job of getting Mindshare that that's now what we use to describe our vacuuming. I mean, I've done it already today, haven't I? I've said Google, right? I'm going to Google something, right? So again, that's Mindshare. And this was always an interesting quotation that I'd share with them. If you own this child at an early age, you can own this child for years to come. And this was the president of Toys R Us who said this, or Kids R Us, sorry. And really, that's where I think where we're at right now, is there is this attempt of getting more and more Mindshare. So I would share some interesting facts with them. The US Army is big into Mindshare. If you don't know, most recruits come from the world of video gaming. They know and they understand that kids who play video games, especially violent video games, are more likely to go into the Army. And so that's where they put their money. I don't know if you're familiar with the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, but I know for sure one year the US Army had the biggest booth at the Consumer Electronics Show. Okay? And they also said this: when it comes to recruitment costs, we measure things by an hour of person Mindshare. TV could cost anywhere between $5 and $10 an hour because commercial time is expensive. The cost of person Mindshare with gaming is about 22 cents. So the US Army actually made their own free-to-play game, right? War game. And they knew, again, that if they could get people playing, they're going to get that Mindshare, like they said, for 22 cents per person. So, oh, by the way, I have to throw this in too. If you don't know, the Army also has a Hollywood script vetting. Like they're in Hollywood, and any Hollywood film that's made has to send the scripts to them. And they read them, and they decide whether or not they will support it or not. I imagine you can guess which ones they support and which ones they don't, right? And when we talk about support, I mean like actually lending them multi-million-dollar jets and helicopters. So a film like Top Gun, which glorifies war to some degree, full support. A film like Apocalypse Now, no, you're not going to get any support, right? So again, they're very careful in making sure that they are getting the information out there that they want, or the perception that they want. So then we would do this fun little exercise. Who is getting the most Mindshare? The average American child can recognize 1,000 corporate logos but cannot identify 10 plants or animals native to their own region. Okay? And they'd look at me and they'd say, no way, that can't be true. I'd say, okay, well, let's do this then. Let's try it ourselves. So I discovered this thing called the alphabet logo. It's actually an art installation, but it worked really well. And what I'd do is I'd put up 15 slides of plants. And I'd ask them, okay, identify. Tell me how many of these you can identify. Right? Now, I will admit, I'm not even sure this is the same slide I used. These aren't the best photos. Okay? And we've talked about that too. But I think the most I ever had out of the slides, they would get 2 right. 2 out of 15, right? Maple, I think, is there. Well, here are the answers. All right, so I'd show them the answers, and they'd say, oh, yeah, I knew that one, I knew that one. And then I'd say, okay, I'm going to show you an alphabet. And this alphabet is simply made up of the first letter of products. Let's see how many of these you can identify. And I would put this up. And they'd get really excited, first of all. They'd be like, oh, and you could hear, some of them would start yelling them out, right? Now, these are 26 letters. They're just letters, okay? And I'd say to them, first of all, these are old letters, right? Some of these, and they're also American. A lot of the stuff I'm going to share with you today is American because we simply don't have as much information in Canada as we do from the States. So I'd say to them, like 5 or 6 of these are American. You probably won't know them. 5 or 6 of them are old. They've updated the letter. I'd still get students who would get 17 or 18 of these, right? And they were very proud of it. Too. They thought it was great. And I'd say, doesn't this illustrate that point I just made, right? That who's getting the most Mindshare? Well, it's corporations, right? It's the media. Yeah, and again, if you're seeing if you know them yourself, there are the answers, all right? So like I said, like Hebrew National, I think is only in the States, so it's not one they would know. But we'd start yelling them out, right? And they'd all, I think, was more American. Bubblicious they'd get, Campbell's they'd get. But once we got to like Ice, Jell-O, Kool-Aid, they'd be yelling them out, right? They'd all be yelling them out together because they knew them all, right? So somehow, and I'd remind them, these are just the first letters, right? These aren't even the full logos, and they've managed to get that big a piece of your mind. So that would lead to some conversation about the subconscious mind. And again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on any of this stuff, but I would just say to them, my understanding is that yes, the conscious mind, we actually see something, we recognize it. The subconscious mind works a little bit differently in that perhaps things, are getting into our mind without us being aware of it. And I would tell them this story about Kraft dinner, strange story. I was home sick one day from school, and I remember scrolling Facebook, and I scrolled it, and as I often do, I kind of got to the place where I thought I had finished. I stopped there, I got off the computer, and I started thinking about eating lunch. And for some reason, I remember thinking, boy, I really want Kraft dinner. And I'm not a huge Kraft dinner eater. We have it in our house, but I was like, I want Kraft dinner. So I went and had it. I went back to Facebook, I did the scrolling again, and I get to where I finished, and lo and behold, what do I see? A Kraft dinner ad. And I suddenly became aware that I didn't consciously recognize that the first time through, right? But clearly it had impacted me without seeing it, without consciously registering it, right? And again, that's often the way that the subconscious mind works. And that's, again, an argument, like I said, about why, when we let the filters down, when we're not challenging things, it just kind of gets into our minds. These are things that we see but don't necessarily acknowledge. This would then lead to a conversation about subliminal messages. And again, there's some debate about whether subliminal messages work or not. The first story I heard about subliminal messages was a guy who ran a movie theater, and he decided he was going to splice 2 frames of popcorn into the film about every 20 minutes. Now, if you remember film, usually like 30 frames a second, you can't actually see 2 frames by themselves. It looks like a little blip on the screen. And he claimed that after he did this, his popcorn sales went up 50%. Right? So the theory is that even though people aren't consciously seeing it, the subliminal message is getting through to them and it's making them want popcorn. So again, since then I've read that perhaps this isn't true. But this was kind of a fun experiment. Oh, think also of casinos, right? Casinos work a lot on your kind of subconscious mind in that, there are lots of bells and lights and whatever, and it's supposed to make you feel like everybody's winning. Oh, if I just keep playing a little bit longer, I'll be that lucky person, right? That's how they're designed, and there's lots of messages like that. Well, I'm just going to share this one with you because I used to love doing this with my students. So I'm going to show you this slide, right? And this is actually an ad from a Toronto newspaper. I'm not sure which one. And if you look at it, it's kind of way before Match.com, right? You used to have these singles organizations, right, that would match you with people. And so I would say to my students, okay, so there's this ad. Now remember, when you buy an ad in the newspaper, you pay for the amount of space. Why would they pay for these flowers? Why wouldn't they just crop it in half, save the money, right? Why are the flowers there? And I'd say, maybe you might see something in there, although it was very rare that they did. Right now, when I look at this, there is something there that I can't not see, okay? But my guess is that none of you are seeing it right now. Is there any, now don't yell it out, because my students, if they thought they saw it, would yell it out. Does anyone think they see something in the flowers? Maybe, yeah? Okay, well, we'll find out if you're right or not in a second. So here is kind of my helpful version. If you look at the black that I've used a marker to outline, there's SEX. Now hang on a second, because it's actually going to be better in the last one. This one's still a little bit hard to see. But if you recognize what I'm talking about, right? You see the letters SEX, look in that space, and I'll go back, right? Can you see the word now? Okay, so when I put up this slide now, that's the first thing I see. And if I ever do this to you again, if you're ever lucky enough to hear this presentation again, and I put this slide up, that's the first thing you're going to see, right? But it's amazing to think that just a few moments ago, very few, if any of you saw it. Is that what you actually saw? Yeah. So it does happen once in a while that someone sees it, but it's very rare. Now, the theory is, of course, is that as we're looking at this ad, we don't consciously see the word sex, but we're thinking, boy, if I sign up to this singles club, I'm going to get a lot of sex. Right? I mean, I think that's what the suggestion is. Now, they always like that and thought that was kind of fun, but then I'd tell them, there are theories that there are naked bodies in the ice on Coke machines, right? I don't know if you've ever heard that one, that there's kind of sexual imagery in some of the Disney films that if you pay attention to that you'll see. There's lots of this stuff. Again, I don't know how much of it is actually real, but it would kind of pique their interest, right? Anytime you talk about sex in class, it was kind of like, ooh, right? This is something we shouldn't be talking about. And I'm like, no, that's okay. So, at this point, I think I had them on board. I would say for the most part, I had 90% of my students like, okay, we need to know more about this. And that's when I would say, okay, now we agree that there's something in the water, now we need to understand, let's kind of dive in and figure out how do we better understand it. And I always come back to these 8 key concepts. And this is, like I said, a much reduced version of them. And if you were to Google this, the key concepts of media literacy, you'd probably find that there are different lists all over the place. In the States, there are a couple lists that have 5. I think this one has even changed slightly since I started teaching it. But I'm going to stick with the 8, and I'm going to explain to you how they changed for me as I taught it as well. So the first one says this. It simply says that all media are constructions. And what I would really emphasize is that, first of all, perhaps this is the most important concept, and that the word all is really important, right? Because I think most people will say, oh yeah, some media does this, but I would always come back and say, no, it's all media. We're not talking about just some stuff, it's everything. So all media are constructions, and this says that media do not present simple reflections of external reality. They are carefully crafted constructions that have been subjected to a broad range of decisions. And again, I would often highlight words for them. I love that phrase, carefully crafted constructions. The people who make these things are excellent at what they do. They get paid a lot of money to do it. And so one of the ways, of course, of revealing this is kind of deconstructing. So we would do things like I would show them, okay, here's a scene from Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds, right? This is what the scene looks like on the screen. Here's what it actually looks like to make it, right? Look at the number of people who are involved in shooting that one shot. I would say to them, when you go to the movies, stick around for the credits. They do that now because these Marvel movies, you got to if you want to see that little bit at the end. But I'd say, look at all those names, right? Every one of those people is making a decision to make that piece of media the best it can be, right? It is a construction. And the other part of it is that technically they are often superb. Right? So I would explain to them, there are, I don't know if you've ever seen what's called a B movie, right? Like not the B movie, B-E-E, but a B movie as in a movie that's done cheaply. And sometimes they don't have enough money, they only take one shot, and they're shooting and all of a sudden the boom mic comes into the frame. And I said, if you're watching that, that's kind of the opposite of this. That's not superb, right? And as soon as that happens, you're almost drawn out of it. You're like, oh yeah, this is a movie. Well, most media works the opposite way. It's so well done that we have no understanding. We just see it as a seamless extension of reality. And that's combined with the fact that we see it everywhere, right? We are so familiar with these techniques that, again, we don't question them. So I would love showing them this cartoon, Gary Larson, in the days before television, right? And they'd be like, what does that mean? I'm like, well, think about it. TV is such a big part of our lives now that probably everybody in here has a room that all the couches are facing the wall. And and if you take that TV out of there, it's a little weird, right? That we have these rooms. But and so again, I think this makes the point that it's hard for us to even imagine the world without that, right? Okay, so on to, oh yes, and our task, of course, with this concept was to expose the seams. So we would sometimes do things like shot breakdowns, right, where you actually analyze a scene and break it down shot by shot and try to figure out, why did the director choose to do a low angle here or a high angle, and even finding edits. I was always surprised. This was a grade 11 class that I taught, and for the most part, no, sorry, not for the most part, there were always a few students who didn't even know what an edit was, right? They couldn't recognize an edit, and that was kind of shocking to me. If we're going to claim, I'm going to talk about this later, that we're teaching media literacy at the young ages, you would think that most people should be able to recognize a basic edit. All right, concept number 2, the media construct, in brackets, versions of reality. I've left the brackets there because this is one of those concepts where I've seen both, and I think both apply. So the first way that I interpret is this: when observations come to us pre-constructed by the media with attitudes, interpretations, and conclusions already built in, then the media, rather than we ourselves, are constructing our reality. Okay? I don't know if you spend time on Twitter or on X or whatever it's called now. I do it from time to time. My wife says it's really bad for me and I shouldn't. But I like to kind of get a sense of where the world is at. If you go on Twitter right now, you will see 2 very different worldviews. Very different worldviews. And they are all because of the media. Just a simple example is that, there's a guy who I follow now who just walks around New York City. And all he's trying to do is show to people that, New York City is still a great place. And it's amazing the number of people who get into his tweets or respond and say, oh yeah, you're just going to the nice places, right? Or that's not what Donald Trump says. Or, and so their worldview has been shaped so much by the media that they won't even take, someone who's living there, their perspective. They're just like, no, that's wrong, right? And again, I would argue that their worldview has been constructed by it. I would often use examples from my own life, and this was a big one for me. So I'd show them this photo and I'd say, we know the pyramids, right? We all know the pyramids. I've never been there. All of my experience, everything I know about the pyramids has come through the media. This is kind of my picture of what the pyramids are. You got to get on a camel. You got to ride for 12 hours like Indiana Jones through the desert, right? And suddenly you come across the pyramids and you're like, wow. And then I was shown this photo, right? And I was like, what? Like all of a sudden my worldview disappeared. If you can't tell what's going on here, that's actually a city. See the golf course? The golf course is like 200 feet from the pyramids. I had never seen an image like this, right? And all of a sudden, that concept came to light for me. I was like, yep, that's me. The media had constructed my vision of what the pyramids are, okay? And sometimes this is all it takes. And again, I would use obvious examples, right? Like that's a pretty obvious example, but I would always be careful to explain to them that it's often the more subtle stuff that's a little more dangerous. And I'll get to that in a second too. So the second part, or the other way to interpret is simply that all media have attitudes, interpretations, and conclusions built in. Rather than talking about how it creates our reality, just to be aware that every piece of media that we look at has attitudes, interpretations, and conclusions built in. Here's another good example. So, Prince William has his third child. This is William. Prince William has his third child. Comes out of the hospital, all the paparazzi are there. I assume somebody asked him a question. He puts up, yeah, it's great to have 3 kids. I don't know what he said. But if you looked at the paper and saw this photo, right, you would have one sense of what is going on. However, maybe you see this version, right? Taken at pretty much the exact same time. And again, I like to emphasize this with my students because they'd say, well, a photo is real. Well, again, no. Photos have, I'm a photographer. I know that the choices I make have an impact on the meaning that is created. And this to me is a great example of that. If you think back to O.J. Simpson, right, when he was arrested, this was the version of reality that Newsweek put out. This was the version that Time put out. Now again, this is the first time that I was aware of a company that got in trouble because Time actually altered the photo to make him look more sinister, right? They darkened it, as you can tell. Same photo, different versions of reality, okay? And again, if you want a kind of a simplified cartoon version of it, you've maybe seen this one before, where the media can actually take a scene and depending on what they focus on, they can make it appear one way or the other. I think it was Malcolm X who said something along the lines of the media has the potential of making your best friend your worst enemy or something like that. I've messed that up. But this is that idea, right? And we see one person chasing the other, but when you look at actually what the media is presenting, they're focusing on a small aspect of it and they're making it appear the opposite, all right? So I'm gonna just show, I have a couple little videos that I wanna show you. This was always a fun one. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the spaghetti story or not, but this is just a very quick kind of 3-minute documentary. I'm just gonna let it play and then I'll talk about it after. And hopefully this goes. There we go.
It isn't only in Britain that spring this year has taken everyone by surprise. Here, in the Ticino, on the borders of Switzerland and Italy, the slopes overlooking Lake Lugano have already burst into flower, at least a fortnight earlier than usual. But what, you may ask, has the early and welcome arrival of bees and blossom to do with food? Well, it's simply that the past winter, one of the mildest in living memory, has had its effect in other ways as well. Most important of all, it's resulted in an exceptionally heavy spaghetti crop. The last 2 weeks of March are an anxious time for the spaghetti farmer. There's always the chance of a late frost, which, while not entirely ruining the crop, generally impairs the flavor and makes it difficult for him to obtain top prices in world markets. But now these dangers are over, and the spaghetti harvest goes forward. Spaghetti cultivation here in Switzerland is not, of course, carried out on anything like the tremendous scale of the Italian industry. Many of you, I'm sure, will have seen pictures of the vast spaghetti plantations in the Po Valley. For the Swiss, however, it tends to be more of a family affair. Another reason why this may be a bumper year lies in the virtual disappearance of the spaghetti weevil, the tiny creature whose depredations have caused much concern in the past. After picking, the spaghetti is laid out to dry in the warm alpine sun. Many people are often puzzled by the fact that spaghetti is produced at such uniform length, but this is the result of many years of patient endeavor by plant breeders who've succeeded in producing the perfect spaghetti. And now, the harvest is marked by a traditional meal. Toasts to the new crop are drunk in these poccolinos, and then the waiters enter bearing the ceremonial dish, and it is, of course, spaghetti. Picked earlier in the day, dried in the sun, and so brought fresh from garden to table at the very peak of condition. For those who love this dish, there's nothing like real homegrown spaghetti.
All right. So I used to love showing that documentary, mainly because I do it exactly like that. I just say, hey, I'm going to show you a documentary. It's only 3 minutes. Just watch it. And then I would watch them. And it was almost like in some cases, like, you know how a dog kind of does this? Some of their heads would go like, what am I seeing? Is this real? And then when it was over, I would say to them, okay, what do you think? Believe it or not, probably half a dozen times in my career, I had a few students who believed it. They were like, oh, I didn't know that's where spaghetti comes from. And then, of course, everybody else would laugh, and we wouldn't make fun of them, but we kind of laugh with them or around them or whatever you want to say. And then we talk about, okay, we can recognize those of us who know where spaghetti comes from. Yeah, we find that funny. But did you have a moment where you at least questioned where you thought spaghetti came from? And most of them would say yes, right? They would say, yeah. For a moment, I was like, do I know where spaghetti comes from? And then that would lead to a really good conversation about, well, why is that? Why is it so convincing? And they were good to point out things like, well, it's black and white, right? So it looks like it's historical. It looks like it's an old film that somebody's found. They didn't lie in the old days. It has a voice of God narrator, right? You don't see the person, so that adds authenticity to it. They have lots of great stats in there and talk about the spaghetti weevil, right? And the boccaccino, which is part of the ceremonial first dish. And they say things like, surely you've seen the, right? Like implying that, yeah, if you know where spaghetti comes from, then you know this is true. And I would say to them, okay, great, we recognize these things. Now, what if that was about something that you had no previous knowledge about, right? And that was really the point, was that if you're getting information and you don't know anything about it beforehand and it's coming through the media, how do you know that it's the truth, right? They could be shaping it completely like that, completely making it up. Yeah, like I said, I loved showing that. That was great. So I'm going to get through these last two concepts, and then I know the coffee break is starting, so I'm a little bit behind, but that's pretty much on par for me. Number 3, audiences negotiate meaning in media messages. So when we look at any media text, each of us finds meaning through a variety of factors, right? Personal needs and anxieties. If we like something, if we dislike something, it has an effect on the way we interpret it. I used to say to my kids, you know, if you are deathly afraid of spiders, you're probably not going to like the movie Arachnophobia, which, if you don't remember, is about these giant spiders invading whatever, right? But all of these things have an impact on what we think. The pleasures or troubles of the day. I know in my own experience, I've come home from work, in a bad mood, in a good mood, and watched pretty much the same episode of something and had 2 very different reactions to it. Or I've seen the same film twice in 2 different situations. And the first time I saw it, I didn't like it. And the second time I saw it, I really liked it, or vice versa. Certainly, this is one that's probably more relevant today than ever. Racial and sexual attitudes have an impact on our negotiated meaning, right? Depending on how we see the world. And the same is true of family and cultural background. So realistically, even that spaghetti story that I just showed you, as you were watching it, you were probably illustrating this concept, right? Because you were putting it through these filters. Some of you were laughing at it. I don't want to ask if anybody was going, hey, is this where spaghetti comes from? But again, depending on your prior knowledge, we're all kind of negotiating a different meaning. And of course, this explains how 2 people can watch the same media text and have 2 very different reactions to it. And again, I'll use my Twitter example as an example that if you go on there, you're going to see 2 very different reactions to the same media, all right? What troubles me about this the most is the idea of irony, parody, and satire. Because we've now entered a world where I'm not sure some people understand irony or understand satire. So if you present something as ironic and someone doesn't get the irony, they see it as truth, right? Or the same is true with satire. So this is my example that this happened to me not too long ago. I had a friend who shared this, and if you can't see the sign, it says this: all joggers must wear a helmet. right? So they shared this and they said, look what's going on in Australia. This is coming here next. So I did a very quick search and realized that this comes from The Onion, I think. And if you don't know The Onion, it's a satire site. And I pointed this out to them, right? I said, look, this is not real. This is someone making fun of this idea. And their response was, doesn't matter, it could be real. And I was like, wow, I don't know how we get past that. I don't know how we convince someone, right, that this you are being influenced by this when it's not even real. All right, let me get through this one and then we'll take our coffee break. So media have commercial and economic implications. And what this concept says is that media production is a business and must make a profit. Money impacts content, techniques, and distribution. And program content often makes us a target for advertisers and organizes viewers into marketable groups. So, the easiest way to illustrate this to them about money was simply to share with them some stats about money. So I would tell them things like, if you remember Seinfeld, again, I know the reference is old, but Jerry Seinfeld was offered $2 million per episode to do another season. Per episode, not per season, per episode. Super Bowl ad is always a fun one. Anybody know what a 30-second Super Bowl ad goes for now in the States? $7 million. $7 million. That's up from when I first started teaching, I think it was about $1 million. The average Hollywood film budget is $100 million. And again, when we start thinking about that idea of content, techniques, and distribution, that explains why almost every film that's on the top 10 grossing film list that comes out every year is either a sequel or a reimagining, right? There's very little risk happening in Hollywood these days because they simply can't afford to not make money from these films. So it does have an impact on all of this stuff. And I would ask them this, what is the sole purpose of media? And they'd love to tell me, oh, it's about entertainment and it's about informing. And I'd say, nope, it's about delivering eyeballs to advertisers. That's really it. That's its sole purpose. Now, yes, there are other things that it does. I'm not denying that. But when it comes down to it, it's about delivering eyeballs to advertisers. The second part of the concept talks more about ownership, and again, I think this is important too. Ownership of different media has been concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. This is true in the States and in Canada as well. The small number of companies now control what media we see, and this also impacts what stories get told, as most smaller media outlets are now part of a larger chain. Look at the Sun-Times as an example. I think it's been passed back and forth between these large companies, about 3 or 4 of them. And now I don't even read it anymore because I've been told it's kind of a shell of what it once was, right? We don't get a lot of local stories. Now this is shifting. We know it's shifting online and there are things happening, but certainly it has an impact on what we get to see. And if you don't know, here's an interesting stat. In 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 companies. Now it's owned by 6. 90% of what we consume is owned by 6 companies. Those companies are worth a total of $430 billion, okay? And here they are. GE, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, CBS. They may have changed since I even found this slide because they do often kind of change in there. Now, why is this important? Well, freedom of speech in a monopolized media system proves that the right to raise your voice is different from the ability to be heard. And here's my example of that. This is just a little 30-second Adbusters ad. Just have a look.
The average North American consumes 5 times more than a Mexican, 10 times more than a Chinese person, and 30 times more than a person from India. We are the most voracious consumers in the world, a world that could die because of the way we North Americans live. Give it a rest. November 26th is Buy Nothing Day.
If you're not familiar with Buy Nothing Day, it always happens on Black Thursday now, which is apparently the biggest shopping day in North America. I think they're still doing it. But the interesting thing about this ad is that they had the money to put it on TV. They had actually raised $400,000, and they went to every network channel there was, all of these specialty channels, you know, the Learning Channel, which was about learning at the time. It's certainly not now. The History Channel, all of these other ones. Every one of them except one said, no, we will not run your ad. And they said, well, why? We have the money. It goes against what our other advertisers want, the worldview that they want presented, right? So even though we like to think that, oh yeah, we can be heard, you know, if we can't get our voice out there, it's very different, right? And that's where that term gatekeepers comes from, right? If you're familiar with that. They are the gatekeepers. They get to decide the information that we are going to see. And in this case, they chose not to let this one run. I'm going to pause there. I do have a little bit more to get through. I hope you're still with me, and I hope you're okay with that. Enjoy your coffee and tea and whatever else, and we'll be back here 15 minutes. Okay, thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you for coming back. I'm going to try to increase the pace a little bit because I am a little bit behind, and I know some of you have already made it clear that you have questions, and that's great. I'm glad I'm getting you to think about some things. So I'm just going to jump back into these concepts and try to get through these last four. So the fifth concept that I would teach is this one, which is that says media contain ideological and value messages. And I really tried to make it simple for them, and I would say to them, think of this word, simply reflect, right? That all of our media actually reflects a way of life. So all media products are advertising for themselves, for sure, but also for values or ways of life, right? Typical mainstream North American media convey a number of explicit and implicit ideological messages. So everything we're looking at, even though we're watching maybe a television show, that's a sitcom, it makes us laugh, everything that's in it is also an advertisement for a certain way of life. Okay? And these are the things that often are in these ads. One of the ways to see these, actually, I would tell my kids is it's hard for us to see them because we're in it, right? It's like that water thing again, the fish in the water. So sometimes, actually going somewhere else, traveling, and seeing the media in other countries helps. Sometimes talking to somebody who's come from somewhere else here and asking them their impressions. It's pretty eye-opening what stands out. So the first one is the nature of the good life and the role of affluence in it. And I've just thrown some slides up. I mean, here's our Lotto Max ads, right, which certainly suggests this is what the good life is. The virtues of consumerism. I used to have an ad up on my wall that literally said, shopping is good, right? So, and here are some other ideas. Often patriotism is connected to shopping. You can see in the top right corner, I am not a shopaholic, I am helping the economy, right? So again, there's a certain virtue to actually buying stuff. The proper role of men and women. Now again, this is one that's changing a lot. I've used an old example here because I found this kind of useful, right? Here's the typical male, camel, pleasure to burn. Whoops, sorry, jumped ahead too much. There's the female version, right? Same ad campaign, produced at the same time, two very different messages to that pleasure to burn. There's also, especially for females, although I would say it's true for males today too, sometimes some mixed messages. I love this cartoon. Nursing, this is a shopping mall. We can't allow women to brazenly display their breasts. And of course, we see the ad behind, right? Which is very common in our advertising world. The acceptance of authority. I'm worried some of you aren't going to like when I put this guy up. But there he is, right? I mean, Dr. Fauci, we were just expected to accept what he had to say. Again, I'm not going to question too much right now. We'll leave that for another time. And unquestioning patriotism. And again, I'd love to show these two photos. If you're not familiar with them, the one on the left is Iwo Jima, which, by the way, the story is that the photographer screwed it up the first time, and he had to actually get the soldiers to go and do it again to get the photo. Talk about constructing reality. The photo on the right is from 9/11, right? And there's certainly an echo. Remember, we talked about how negotiating meaning, there is a reflection here, right, of the previous one. I'm a big sporting guy. I do watch probably too many sports, and the patriotism is astounding sometimes, right? I mean, these giant-sized flags that they like to bring out, the jets flying overhead. Even when I start watching my NCAA basketball this year, the first game they always do is sponsored by the Army. Last year, they literally played on an aircraft carrier. Right? And so they set up a basketball court on the aircraft carrier, and all the uniforms had like camouflage pattern to them, right? Like they were soldiers. So again, this stuff is just there. We're not meant to think about it too much. One of the best ways I found to get my kids to see this was actually showing them old sitcoms. So I would show them an episode of Leave It to Beaver. And then, of course, they'd think it's crazy. It was one of my favorite shows. But and I'd ask them, okay, what are the values in this show? And they'd be quick to point out things like, well, everybody's white, right? They would talk, well, they don't look so white in this photo, bad photo, sorry. They would talk about how mom stays at home, right? She's always in the kitchen, and when she's in the kitchen, she always has her dress and her pearls on, right? Dad goes out to work. If there's a problem with the boys, it's wait till dad gets home, right? They have their white picket fence, they have their house. There are lots of values in that. And then we would look at a show, a more modern show, like literally Modern Family. And again, they were quick to say, okay, now I get it. Right now we see that we have different types of relationships. We have a gay couple, we have an older man and a younger woman, and then we kind of have the traditional family as well. Well, they're the ones that get mocked the most, I think, in the show. But again, it just, it does reveal to us that there are values inside of this. I would often do the same thing with the idea of being Canadian. Right? One of the things that the concept talks about is that we are influenced tremendously by American media. And it's very hard sometimes for us to actually figure out what it means to be Canadian. So we would talk about, at the time, it was disaster films. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this film, but this is a Canadian disaster film called Last Night. And if you were to watch these two, they're very different. I would say to them, first of all, in American disaster films, the disaster never happens. Or if it does, it's only minimal because there's a hero. Right? In this case, it's Bruce Willis who saves the day, goes up on the asteroid, blows it up, whatever. I can't remember exactly. But that's what happens. In Last Night, it's quite fascinating because we're not even told what's happening. We just know that the world is ending. And the whole movie is about what would people do if they knew the world was going to end? And some of the things are quite interesting. And of course, it actually ends with the world ending, which is not very American. Right? So again, we talk about the differences between our own media. Concept number 6. So if concept number 5 is reflect, concept number 6 is affect, right? How does it actually affect us? And we talk about, although the media may not create values and attitudes, they do legitimize and reinforce them. This affects things like the changing nature of family life and the use of leisure time. So the actual mediums do this, right? Here's an example. Family life has changed because of our devices. I would argue too that I grew up in Owen Sound, and I spent most of my childhood either on a baseball diamond in elementary school or on a basketball court in high school. And I drive around Owen Sound now, and I don't see a lot of that happening, right? Pickup games in places. Lots of organized stuff. That's a little bit different, right? And so it has changed the way that we use our leisure time. It also talks about how media can elect and I've added these words, or ruin leaders largely on the basis of image. And I've added those words because my 2 examples show that. The first one is Gary Hart. If you remember this story, Gary Hart was running, I think, to be the Democrat presidential candidate. And suddenly this photo came out. And if you don't know, this is not his wife. And he's wearing a shirt that says monkey business. And this photo was in the newspaper, and he immediately was out of the race. It happened that quickly. You may be familiar with this photo. Robert Stanfield, right? So if you don't know the story behind this one, what I've read is that they were on the tour across Canada. One of the planes had to be fixed, so they had some time on the tarmac. They got out. The press got out of one plane. Stanfield and his people got out, and they were throwing the football around. Somebody convinced him to take part. Apparently, he actually caught the ball quite a few times. But this was the photo that one of the photographers caught, and this was the photo that they ran. And the headline was "A Political Fumble." And a lot of people, again, say that this was probably the end of his campaign, right? This one photo. Again, I don't need to say too much about this, I don't think, but when we talk about an image makeover, right, we've seen it here just recently, okay? For better or worse, media has made our world a global village. So this is a Marshall McLuhan idea. And he said that, yes, the media, what they do is they involve us in things around the world. And I think we would all agree with that. Even while we've been sitting here, maybe you've gotten a notification of something that's happened in the Ukraine or in Russia, right? This was something that was unheard of many years ago. 100 years ago, it would have taken weeks for that information to get to us. Now we're instantly involved. Okay? So we are really a global village. And this is the one, I think I messed up my slides. The struggle for a distinctive Canadian society continues to be difficult, right? So we are trying to be Canadian in the face of this kind of giant elephant to our south that dominates our airwaves, all right? All television is educational television. The only question is, what is it teaching, right? So we like to talk about PBS and TVO being our educational television. All television is educational television. So one of the things that happened with these concepts, I always struggled with those two when I taught them. And because I was trying to figure out, well, I don't think they're separate, right? I was trying to figure out where does the reflecting end and the affecting begin. And so I found this video called The Merchants of Cool, which is all about cool hunting. Another topic for another time, great topic. Made by a guy named Douglas Rushkoff, and he's a cultural critic, and he's done a bunch of documentaries for PBS. And in this video, he's been down in Florida during spring break, and at the time, this was, college-age people would go down, and they'd get kind of wild, right? And there were lots of videos of teenagers flashing and whatever else. And then he went back to this modeling conference that he was talking to this 14-year-old girl. And in the video, he's at a dance where they're all there, and he says that he realized that as soon as the girl saw the camera, her behavior changed. And that's when he got this idea in his head of the feedback loop. And this, to me, explains how these two things interact. And what he said is this, is that teenagers act out in public, the media films them. The media repackages that footage and plays it endlessly. So this was the MTV age. So they would, every time there's a commercial break, you would see this footage. Teens see the footage and imitate what they see, and we're back to where we begin, right? So they're acting, so it's reflecting in one case, but as it comes back around, it's actually starting to affect their behavior. I taught this a couple years ago, and my students taught me this, devious licks. I don't imagine any of you have heard of it because I had no idea what this was. This was a TikTok trend. And what happened was a student, I think somewhere out west, maybe in BC, went into a washroom in their school and stole a mirror. Okay? Took it off the wall, put it into his bag. He filmed it. He posted it to TikTok, shared it. Teens saw the footage on TikTok, and they started doing the same thing. And within a day, right? This was posted in the morning. By the end of the day, we were having things stolen from our washrooms in our school, right? That's how fast it was happening, okay? So again, I think it's a good example of the feedback loop. And I even added this, this idea of influencer culture. If you don't know what influencers are, this is kind of social media people, right, who are trying to sell us stuff. So a person uses a product, they film themselves using it, they package it, post it to social media, others see the footage, they buy the product, and that person then becomes the influencer, right? So they call it a loop. I almost think it's more like a spiral because it seems to me that things are getting faster and faster as well, right? So even my example before, the first one, to the devious licks, it went from, a couple months to a day. And that led me to this idea. If you're not familiar, there's this idea of jolts per minute when it comes to media. And the theory is that as media progresses, the jolts per minute increase. So films that we watch today are edited much faster than they used to be, for instance, right? And so this just kind of takes a few of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but so we might go from journalism where at one time it was newspapers, then it became multimedia and the fast culture, and now we're in what they're calling the dopamine culture where it's clickbait. I just talked to somebody at the break about clickbait, right? About how these headlines are what draw us in now. You got to see what happened, all right? Or with music. We've gone from listening to albums to listening to tracks, and now if you're not aware, TikTok is actually where most music is sold, right? That's how kids get their music today is through TikTok. Or with images, we used to view on a gallery wall, then we view on our phone, now we scroll through the phone, right? And the scrolling, of course, is endless. All right, so number 7. This was one of my favorites. Form and content are closely related in the media. Basically, this is Marshall McLuhan's idea again, that the medium is the message. And what he said is this, a medium's content is less significant than the medium itself. It is the medium and not the content that has a greater impact in shaping our perception. So the how, right, becomes more important than the what. Okay? And what we used to do is I would say to my students, imagine that we witnessed a newsworthy event. And then let's talk about, okay, the radio is going to cover it, the television news is going to cover it, the internet's going to cover whatever it was, right? And we would just simply go through and talk about the differences. So the radio, maybe you get 5 minutes of news, the story's going to be about 30 seconds. TV's going to be a little bit longer. You're actually going to see some of the people. Maybe you're going to have actual footage. Get to the newspaper, well, it's going to take a little bit longer to get that one, but it's going to be a longer piece, right? And each one of those has an impact on the actual message itself. One of my favorite videos that I used was a little 10-minute New York Times documentary on the woman who spilled coffee on herself, and then there was this $1 million lawsuit. And they did a really good job of actually explaining how that story, which is quite a tragic story, if you've never seen it, you should look it up, because she had serious, serious burns. She was really hurt, and all she was looking for was the money to pay for her hospital bills. And then slowly, as the story got smaller and smaller, right down to Twitter size, which is what at the time was 140 characters, it was simply, woman spills coffee on self, wins the lottery, right? And she died really being a hated person, or if nothing else, the butt of a lot of jokes. And she found that very troubling, because that's not what she was after. And again, I think that McLuhan would agree with me that illustrates this concept, that depending on where you get that information, actually it biases the message. I think McLuhan, if you know anything about him, he was a pretty eccentric guy and he had some pretty eccentric ideas. He also would go further than that, I think. And he might agree with this idea, that we shape the tools and then the tools shape us. Right? So again, think back to my slide with the phones, that the phone is changing our lives. So it's actually the medium itself that is having an impact on the way that we see the world and the way that we interact with that world. The last concept says this: each medium has a unique aesthetic form. And all it really says is our enjoyment of media is enhanced by an awareness of how pleasing forms or effects are created. So once you understand how something works, right, you can then appreciate it more. So in my class, once I was done teaching these concepts, I would regularly have students come to me and say, Mr. Fearnall, I hate this class. And I'd be like, what? Why do you hate it? And he said, because I can't watch a TV show now without seeing the edits. Or I can't watch a film without realizing that the music is making me cry, or whatever it was. And I'd say, that's a good thing, right? That is a really, really good thing. I'd say, stick with it, because eventually you'll get to the point where you can do both, where you can recognize that you're being manipulated, and then you can also recognize how and appreciate the art in being manipulated in some ways. I mean, really, that's what I do now. I watch some really lousy TV, guilty pleasures, I call them. And, so I'll give an example, Survivor. My family used to like watching Survivor when my kids were young. And I used to find it fascinating how they would manipulate us, right? At the end of the episode, the cliffhanger, I remember one, they'd show a shot of a guy, then they showed a shot of a crocodile, and then they showed the shot of a helicopter flying away. And they're saying, you can't miss this. And of course, we're all like, oh my God, this guy is going to get eaten by a crocodile. And of course, when you watch the episode the next week, all that happened was he was trying to build the fire, and he breathed in smoke, and he fell into the fire and burned his hands, right? And then the helicopter flew him away. But the way it was created was to create this serious, oh, you can't miss this, right? Well, I like being able to do that. I like being able to recognize the aesthetic or the artistic form behind it. And I think that really, to me, is what critical thinking is all about, right? Being able to recognize how we are being manipulated by these things. Alan Watts is another thinker that I love. He said this: we seldom realize, for example, that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own, for we think in terms of languages and images which we did not invent, but were given to us by our society. All right? And Chomsky, another favorite, he who controls the media controls the mind. So I'm going to add this to it. I hope it's not too arrogant for me to put my name next to Chomsky. They who understand the media better understand the mind, right? And I think by understanding those 8 concepts, we can actually do that, right? So even in conversation with my friend the other day, we talked about, well, aren't they memorizing the concepts? And I said to them, no, my goal was never to get my students to memorize them. It was to actually practice them, right? To use them until they get to the point where, like I said earlier, it just becomes second nature, all right? So that's basically the concepts. I'm going to get through this really quickly because this is the important part that I think ties this all up. Very quickly, what is the history of media literacy in our school system? Well, like I said, in 1987, we were on the cutting edge of media literacy education. We actually had 4 separate courses, 2 at the grade 11 level and 2 at grade 12. Advanced and general was what we used at the time. Really important point, though. The courses at the time could count towards your mandatory English credits. Okay, that's a really significant thing because we had between 4 and 6 courses every year. There were 2 of us who were teaching it. Then along comes Mike Harris in 1998 and his Common Sense Revolution, and they simply eliminate the courses. They're gone. And only because media educators at the time spoke up. I found an article Jeff Pavir wrote about, that we have to be, I'll get to the quote in a second. No, here it is here. To wit, remove the tools of critical interpretation and you're far less likely to be criticized, right? So there was this idea, is this why he's doing it? So they relented a little bit. They reintroduced 1 grade 11 open course to replace the 4. However, the course could not count as one of the mandatory English credits. So we went from 4 to 6 credits to 1, maybe 2 a year. In my last few years of teaching it, I was lucky to get that one. I had to fight for it, right? But I kept insisting, and I was lucky to be able to do it. The government justified this move by saying that 25% of our regular English courses could focus on media literacy, right? Oh, we're making it more about media literacy. And I say that's crap. It's not happening. Because my fellow English teachers said to me, we don't understand this, right? We're not capable of teaching this, right? They often would come to me and say, how could I do this? So what ended up happening was that media literacy became, we studied Romeo and Juliet, we're gonna watch a film version of it, right? Or we're gonna make an ad related to it. Again, nothing wrong with that. Those are useful exercises, but I would say if you're gonna show the film, then you need to ask some really tough questions about the film. Why did they make this choice? Why did they do this? Why did they cut this out? Why did they add this? Whatever it is, right? That to me is more like about media literacy. So where are we at right now? Basically, it seems to me that it's been replaced with what they call digital literacy. And the main focus of that is on production. So again, like I said, lots of production happening, but not a lot of theory. And again, most of my students, when they left English media, they were drawn away by media arts and comtech, communications technology. And those are all production-heavy courses. It's not really being taught in English. I would say I don't think it's being taught in any class, sadly. Again, it's a bit of a generalization. I can only go by what I've heard and who I've talked to. I'm sure there are individual teachers here and there who are doing it, but for the most part, it's not happening. Okay? I'm not sure it's being, the actual course is being, sorry, the English media course that I taught was retired when I retired. When I went, it went, okay? Nobody else wanted to teach it, nobody else stepped forward. I think the administration was happy to be done with it because I had been a bit of a thorn in their side, to be honest. I'm not sure the course is being taught anywhere in Blue Water. Now, I could be wrong, but I have a feeling, even 10 years ago when I would talk to people, some schools were doing comtech, some were doing media arts. I wasn't aware of many that were doing English media. And just as an example, even the resources that you find now have changed. So this Media Awareness Network was my go-to for media stuff early on. It was a not-for-profit organization. If you go to their page now, it's been rebranded Media Smarts. It has a huge number of corporate sponsors. And I love to challenge them on that. So they'll post something and I'll say, well, I see that B.A.L.L's one of your sponsors. Why aren't you asking this question? And they never respond to me. Right? Like always, they just kind of ignore me. And but I think that's important, right? They should at least acknowledge that. So what's the result? Well, I think that there are lots and lots of people who believe that the media simply does not affect them, right? Like I said earlier, they're either not aware of it or they simply believe that it's not having an impact on them. They believe that they're personally immune to it. This is an interesting idea. I learned this about multitasking. I read the study once where they had people watch others multitask. Here they're going to do 3 things while they're on their phone. You just watch them. At the end, they asked those people, do you think they did better or worse multitasking? 100% of the time, people said they did worse. They weren't good multitaskers. And then they shifted it, right? And they said, okay, what about you? Can you multitask? Can you use your phone while doing other things? Oh yeah, I can do it, right? I'm good at it. I actually am better at it. That's the idea of personal immunity. And I think this applies to a lot of things in our culture. I see a lot of people still on their phones while they're driving. I'm assuming that those people think they're personally immune, right? They think, oh yeah, I can see that others shouldn't do it, but it's okay if I do it. I've been told this before when I've challenged people. I do my own research, therefore I'm media literate. And I have to say, okay, where are you getting that stuff? Isn't that the media too? They don't like to hear that. Many do not apply their media literacy skills to all media. This is a big one too. They only apply it to the media they disagree with. Right? And I've had many conversations again where people say, yeah, oh look, that's fake news, whatever. And then I challenge them, okay, what about the stuff that your go-to media? And they simply can't, usually that's where the conversation ends. They won't even answer the question, right? Because they aren't willing to acknowledge that perhaps their media, and I gotta say this too, it's a dangerous one because you might get mad at me, but if you are in here and you immediately thought, oh yeah, I know people like that, that might be you. Right? I have to constantly remind myself that, yeah, I'm being affected by this stuff too. In fact, this whole presentation, right, is a version of reality. Right? Sorry, it is my version of reality. You're just kind of along for the ride, I guess. Okay, so I used to end my course with this. So you're hopefully media literate, now what? I am not going to go through all these, but it ranged from forget everything you know and return to the matrix. If you've seen the film, there's actually a character in there who wants to go back into the Matrix. He wants to forget everything he's learned and just, enjoy his blissful life. All the way down to, like question everything, all the way down to unplug completely and to fight the power, right? And I would just kind of, talk about some of these options, maybe work in the media, whatever else. So we understand the value of media literacy. Now what do we do? Well, here we go. We can do nothing. A lot of people do this, get put back into the Matrix. But I think if nothing else, we should make room for questioning, for reflection, and for discussion. And I know that there'll be people in here say, oh, that's happening. I don't know. And I can only go by my own experience. When my daughter was in grade 11, both of my daughters took my media literacy course. Weird teaching your own kid, but it was good, and I'm glad they did, because it gave me some insight into a lot of things. And I remember driving home one day and saying to my daughter, don't you have discussions like this in your other classes? And she said, no. She's never had time for these discussions. And I'm like, what? How can you actually learn things if you're not given room and time to reflect and to discuss and to compare? And I think even talking to some of my fellow teachers, there's so much pressure to get through the curriculum, right? Get through all of this stuff that we don't leave time for that. And I think it is vital. And I mean, that's really how I ran most of my classes, was that we would discuss ideas. And I know that that's how I thrived through high school as well. Like I said, I didn't do all the work, but I loved conversations. If you got me talking about stuff, I was in. I would suggest that we bring back media literacy courses and make them mandatory. Teach everybody this stuff. Everybody should know these concepts, right? Yeah, for sure, as early as possible.
It is one-stop in your time. Media literacy is at primary.
Excellent.
John, can you
Yep.
repeat what people are saying so the whole audience can hear, please?
Sure, sorry, I didn't know where that microphone was going. Yeah, so it is happening. There is now, are they actually teaching the concepts?
I've been retired for 10 years, but I taught media literacy.
Excellent.
As English.
Now, I hate to say this, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's kind of lessened, because that's my experience, is that we kind of peaked somewhere around 2000, and then it's kind of come back down, and partly because of what the government did. Provide training on media literacy and critical thinking to all teachers, right? This is super important. Get away from the facts and whether or not they know their stuff. Teach them how to teach critical thinking. Build media literacy and critical thinking into everything we do. Here's another challenging statement that I shared on Facebook not too long ago. In my opinion, if a teacher uses any sort of resource, including a textbook, and does not talk about how it's a version of reality, they are doing a disservice to education. At least a disservice to critical thinking. Everything we teach is a version of reality. We should acknowledge that. Teach critical thinking rather than passive acceptance. This is a little bigger idea. I personally think we need to get out of the PR game. A lot of our education system or our school system, it's about PR. And I'm not going to get into too many examples today because I could bore you with a lot of them. But we talk transparency. I don't see it. I'll give you just one quick example. We did a really, really valuable trip once, and we tried to do it again, and we were told by our administration that the perception would not be good. And that broke our hearts, right? Like, this was something that was just, super valuable. Question ourselves always, and always allow questioning. This goes at all levels of education, right? In the classroom, principals, at senior admin, ministry. Everybody should be answering these questions. And here's a big idea. We could reconstruct our schools focusing on the present person, not their marks or their future career. I added this one. I'm a big believer in synchronicity. And I have to tell you about this synchronous thing that happened recently. Last Thursday when I was driving to Toronto, I was deep into this, trying to figure out what I was going to talk to you here about. And I listened to CBC Ideas. And they right now have a podcast up on, here, let me get this guy's name up here. Wilhelm von Humboldt. Anybody listen to this? Oh my goodness. I had no idea that this guy basically created our modern education system in about 18 months, right? Elementary, secondary, university. However, he also had this concept of Bildung. And Bildung means this. The purpose of education is to teach a person to develop their full capacities, free of all constraints that might be introduced by commercial interests, by vocations, by the demands of the state. I would argue right now our system is the opposite. That we are focusing on the last things in this statement, and we're not focusing on teaching the person to develop their full capacities. He said this too, the idea is to develop in yourself the capabilities of critical thinking, right? And actually, he even used these words, which I love. He said it's kind of subversive. That's my thing. He said that in secondary school, we should actually be freeing our students from our system, right? Our goal is to give them enough skills that they no longer need us, because then they can go off to university and do real research. And here's Mr. Einstein: education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. So one of the big roadblocks, in my opinion, is the way that we are structured. And I'm not convinced here, I'm just going to leave this question with you. Do our leaders really want us to see behind the curtain? And if you look at the little Peanuts cartoon there, right, no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. I'd like to tell my students that, yes, I wanted them to overthrow me. Not really, literally, but I mean, I loved when they challenged me, when they asked me difficult questions, when they said things to me that made me go, wow, I had never thought of it that way. That, to me, is where real education happens. Here's a big one, and I had to include it because I just found this recently too. Okay, if we're not going to do any of that stuff, if we're not going to build that into it, can we at least do this? Doris Lessing said this: ideally, what should be said to every child repeatedly throughout his or her school life is something like this: you are in the process of being indoctrinated. We have not yet evolved a system of education that is not a system of indoctrination. We are sorry, but it is the best we can do. What you are being taught here is an amalgam of current prejudice and the choices of this particular culture. The slightest look at history will show how impermanent these must be. You are being taught by people who have been able to accommodate themselves to a regime of thought laid down by their predecessors. It is a self-perpetuating system. That's a big idea. Those of you who are robust and individual than others will be encouraged to leave and find ways of educating yourself, educating your own judgments. Those that stay must remember always and all the time that they are being molded and patterned to fit into narrow and particular needs of this particular society. I love that. I mean, I think that that is key to what we're talking about here today, both media literacy and critical thinking. And I'll leave you with my favorite guy. I have to show you this. This is the book that drove a lot of my teaching. If you don't know Neil Postman, he wrote this book, Teaching as a Subversive Act. Love this book. And I'll leave you with two of his thoughts. This is one that relates specifically to media. Neil Postman said, if students get a sound education in the history, social effects, and psychological biases of technology, they may grow to be adults who use technology rather than used by it. Many of my students are slaves to their technology, right? It controls them, they don't control it. And if I had to come up with one statement for all of our education, the purpose, I also agree with Mr. Postman. He said this: the sole purpose of education should be to sharpen students' crap detectors. That's it, right? And in many ways, to me, that's what media literacy does, is we are sharpening their crap detectors. And I'll leave you with this: I cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them think. I hope I have made you think a little bit today, and thank you for letting me do this. Wow. I took a long time.
Are your heads full? So we have time for a couple of questions, and I know that John would be delighted to stay and chat with people afterwards, and he's quite welcome to being challenged. So
Sure am.
if there's something you'd like to take him on with, that would be great.
I wonder if I could start us off with a comment and question from Gary Lewis online. First, Gary says, you've made an excellent case for saving TV shows and then playing by eliminating the ads. You know, TiVo.
Yeah.
Thank you, Netflix. Second question from Gary, are there reliable media outlets that you would recommend? We may not have time for that answer.
My quick answer, and I actually said this to somebody at the break, is I think the real answer is trying to find a variety of sources. I'm not sure you can rely on one, right? My idea would be to read as much as you can, because probably the truth lies somewhere in between all of those, if that makes sense, right? Certainly there are more reliable ones than others. Again, it just seems that that's all changing as well, and it's a difficult thing to understand.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I hope I can phrase my question correctly because I have so many thoughts in my...
Welcome to my world.
This morning, just reading the news in my device, I read the Atlantic magazine, and I came across a very interesting article of the different media, particularly from the Republicans, yet the Democrats, and one thing that is commonly getting to me is the predominance of Canadian youth involved in digital media from the far-right thought. And I wonder if this historical evolution that you gave us, even though it is only in Ontario, has something to do with it. Because how is it that Rebel News, for example, or the Proud Boys have emerged so predominantly in these dilemmas of political discourse?
Wow, there's a lot there. I think one of the ideas that kind of came to my head as you were asking is this idea of the echo chamber. Are you familiar with the echo chamber? Most people understand how the echo chamber works, right? Is that basically the algorithm, which is kind of our new rating system, feeds us what we want to hear. And if you're not careful and actually active in trying to break that echo chamber, you can very quickly just be immersed in things that support whatever it is that you already believe or reinforce some of those ideas. That's one of the things I do with social media is I actually try to acknowledge both sides. And what I mean by that is I do click on things that maybe most people wouldn't. And the reason I do that is because I want to see both sides, right? I don't want my Facebook, my Twitter, my whatever it is become an echo chamber. I want to, and maybe that answers the first question as well, is that, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. So why these people are getting involved, I mean, a simple answer might be that that's all they know, right? Their echo chamber is just simply giving this back to them, right? You tie that to what I said earlier about how we are living next to this behemoth of a media country. That might also explain why Canadians are getting involved as well. The other answer might simply be it's a way to make money, right? Like influencers are making a lot of money these days, and are they selling their soul to make that money? You know what I mean? I just happened to see a show the other day about it's a UK show, and it was a young girl who was coming to actually visit some of the most far-right youth Republican influencers. And it was quite fascinating that, they went to her home, and of course, it was a little like The Handmaid's Tale, right? The father was sitting at the head of the table reading from the Bible, talking about how women must be subservient to men. And at the same time, he was claiming that he's teaching his daughters to be critical thinkers, right? And I just couldn't connect those two things. But in his head, perhaps because, again, this echo chamber and these ideas, he really believes that. Right? We have to, and that's why I said I'm always interested in being challenged, because I don't think we can get anybody out of that without a challenge. Can I share one other? Sorry, there's a question. I don't want to keep rambling. Does that kind of answer your question? Kind of, yes. Okay, all right.
And unfortunately, this will be our last question, but please go ahead.
It's all my fault. I'm sorry.
Hello, fellow retired teacher.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you, John?
Excellent.
So I don't know if you guys heard driving here this morning, Matt Galloway was interviewing Nora Young on CBC. Some of you might have heard that as you were driving here. Anyway, she is now in a new role where she's basically doing forensic dissection of media.
Okay.
And I wondered if you had any comments on that. She was talking about just the increase in technology in this ever-changing world and how people can fuse images together, make people appear they've said things and been places that they haven't. And of course, with the US election coming up, that is stuff that's happening. So I wondered if you had any comments on that?
I do. I think it's a great idea. My concern is, are we past the point where it's going to be useful? And can I give you an example of something I just read the other day that I think kind of connects? I don't know if you're familiar with Sam Harris, but he's a kind of an American thinker. And he was doing a podcast about what's happening in the States. And one of the points he made, which I found really interesting, they were asking, okay, let's predict what might happen during this election. And he talked about how, if most of you remember that Donald Trump was on the Celebrity Apprentice, right? This is kind of how he made his name. He was on this show. And apparently at the time, there were some recordings that Mark Burnett, who's the producer of the show, made, in which Donald Trump repeatedly used the N-word, right? And there was talk of whether or not he should release these tapes. Well, he decided at the time not to, right? He said, I'm not going to release them. Well, Sam Harris made this really interesting point in that he said, you know, I don't think it would matter if Mark Burnett released them now, right? He was basically arguing that we're long past that point where none of that matters anymore. And another conversation we were having up here is that we seem to be at a point where we just don't know where the truth lies, right? And perhaps the conversation we were having is that's been done purposefully, is that because once you have people so confused, they're much easier to control. Right? You know, I won't say that because I will just open another can of worms. Again, I hope that answered your question, or, yeah? All right, thank you.
Thank you. You've made me think of Terry O'Reilly's show, Under the Influence.
It's a good one.
But under the influence in a much more intense way. And it boggles my mind that there is blind loyalty to what one hears, that a great portion of a population that would believe that their neighbors are eating their pets.
Yeah.
And it's pretty scary stuff.
It is.
You've managed to present a very difficult topic with humor. You've directly related it to what you did in the classroom. And you've also underlined the importance and the seriousness of critically thinking about the media. And for that, we thank you. And I think there's a message for all of us that we need to critically think about what we're listening to and watching every day. So thank you, John, very much.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And if you want more on critical thinking, yes, Carol, I've got it. Our October 24th to December 5th lecture series is on critical thinking with Dr. Christopher DiCarlo, and it will be the essentials to informed decision-making and problem-solving. So John's given us great liftoff to head there in October, and tickets will be on sale very soon. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.